000 or Chapter 1. Mount Hood lay in the eastwood mountain range, and at its base was a quaint little village. The villagers there lived off the land, and didn't have much to do with the outside world. Currently it was dawn, and the villagers were congregated at the village gate to see off a young man of 15 or 16 years of age. He seemed thin and weak, but had a healthy, fair complexion, and an overall charming appearance. He wore an ordinary green robe that had apparently been washed so many times it was nearly worn through. Something about the way he was dressed, plus the innocent look in his eyes, made him seem exceptionally quick-witted. His name was Xiaokan. The surrounding villagers exchanged glances, shrugged helplessly, and then pretended to look even more reluctant to see him leave. A white-haired old man stepped out of the crowd and said, "Xiaokan, ever since your dad and mom left us all so long ago, you have been a..." He paused for a moment. Such a good kid seeing that. Xiaokan hadn't left yet. He continued, "Don't tell me you're not interested in living forever. All you have to do is become an immortal, and then you can live forever. That's a really, really long time. Well, it's time for you to live now. Even a baby eagle must learn to fly eventually. No matter what situations you run into out there, you have to hang in there and keep moving forward. Once you leave the village, you can and supposed to come back, because your path will always lie ahead, not behind." The old man patted Xiaokan kindly on the shoulder. "Live forever," Xiaokan murmured. Tremor ran through him, and a look of determination slowly filled his eyes under the encouraging gazes of the old man and the other villagers. He nodded his head seriously and looked around at everyone one last time. Finally, he turned and walked away from the village. As he disappeared off into the distance, the villagers started to look more and more excited. Their forlorn expressions turned to those of joy, and the kind-faced old man began to tremble. Tears even streamed down his face. The village was soon echoing with cries of rejoicing. Some people even took out gongs and drums and began banging them excitedly. "The whistle is gone," someone said. "But oh, my poor chickens." He hated the roosters crowing at dawn, so he somehow got all the kids in the village to eat every chicken we had. Today is the beginning of a new era. By this point, Xiaokan was still fairly close to the village, and could actually hear the sounds of the gongs and drums. He even caught wind of some of the cries of excitement. He stopped in his tracks, a strange expression on his face. After a moment, he cleared his throat and proceeded on his way. Accompanied by the faint sounds of rejoicing, he began to make his way toward Mount Hood. Mount Hood wasn't a very tall mountain, but it was covered with thick vegetation. Therefore, despite the fact that it was dawn beneath the trees, it was dark and quiet. Double Dog told me that he was hunting some wild pigs a few days ago. Saw him immortal flying around. Xiaokan proceeded along, heart thumping. Suddenly, a rustling sound could be heard from some nearby shrubs. It almost sounded like a wild pig, and it immediately caused Xiaokan to grow extremely nervous. The hair on the back of his neck stood up straight as he asked, "Who is it? Who's there?" He quickly pulled 4 axes and 6 machetes out of his travel pack, but that in and of itself didn't and opposed to make him feel much safer. So he also produced a bit of black incense from within his robe, which he clutched tightly in his left hand. "Don't come out," he shouted, trembling. "Don't even think about coming out. I and oppose. We got axes and machetes, and this incense can call lightning from the heavens, and even summon immortals, if you dare to show your face. You and oppose Ray dead." Finally, he turned and ran toward the mountain path, simultaneously juggling all of the various weapons in his hands. Clanking sounds could eventually be heard as axes and machetes began to fall to the ground left and right. Perhaps whatever it was that had been rustling around in the shrubbery really did end up getting frightened by him. Sounds ceased, and no wild animal burst out of the bushes. Xiaokan hurried toward the mountain, wiping the sweat from his brow. By this point, his face was pale, and he was almost considering giving up this crazy idea of climbing the mountain. But then he thought about the incense stick, which his parents had handed down to him before they died. Supposedly, it had been passed down from their ancestors, a gift bestowed by a down-and-out immortal they had saved before departing. The immortal had given it to them to pay back the kindness they had shown. Furthermore, the immortal had even promised to take a member of the Bai clan as a disciple. He told them that merely burning the incense stick would summon him to their side. Bai the Elgin had actually lit the incense stick more than 10 times in the past few years, and yet no immortal had ever shown up. It had eventually reached the point that Bai the Elgin was starting to suspect whether or not the story about the immortal was even true. Finally, he'd resolved to climb the mountain. For one thing, the incense stick was almost used up, and also, there was the matter of the flying immortal being sighted recently. And that was how he ended up in his current situation. His theory was that if he could get a bit closer to the immortal, then perhaps it would be easier for that immortal to sense the incense stick. Standing in front of the mountain, he hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth, and decided to keep going. Thankfully, the mountain wasn't very high, and it didn't suppose to take long to reach the peak. Where he stopped, panting, he looked at the village down below, and an emotional expression appeared on his face. Then he glanced at the fingernail-sized bit of black incense. It had clearly been burned on numerous occasions, and was almost completely used up. It's been 3 years, bless me, Mom and Dad. It's us to work this time. Bai the Elgin took a deep breath, and then carefully lit the incense. A stiff breeze instantly kicked up, and in the blink of an eye, dark clouds filled the sky. Lightning crackled, and deafening thunder boomed in his ears. The majesty of the entire scene caused Bai the Elgin to tremble. Fearful that he might be killed by the lightning, he very nearly spit on the incense to extinguish it, but managed to hold back. I suppose we lit this incense 12 times in the past 3 years, and this is the 13th time. I have to let it burn. Come on, the Elgin. The lightning won't kill you, at least probably not all 12 times that he had lit the incense in the past. There had been lightning and thunder, and yet no immortal had ever appeared. Each time, he had gotten so scared that he spit on the incense to put it out. He actually found it a bit strange that a supposedly immortal stick of incense could be extinguished with some ordinary saliva. Bai the Elgin sat there shaking in fear as the thunder boomed around him. Suddenly, a streak of light appeared in the air off in the distance. It was a middle-aged man, wearing luxurious clothing. He had the demeanor of a transcendent being, yet he looked weary and travel-worn. In fact, if you looked closely, his eyes seemed to flicker with extreme exhaustion. Finally, I can see exactly what moron has been lighting that incense stick all the time for the past 3 years. Every time the man thought about what he had experienced during the past few years, he got extremely annoyed. 3 years ago, he had sensed the medicinal aura of an incense stick he had given away back when he was in the key condensation stage. That immediately caused him to recall the debt he owed back in the mortal world. The first time he flew out in response to the incense stick being lit, he had assumed it would be a simple matter of heading out and then immediately returning. He had never imagined that before even being able to find the incense, its aura would suddenly vanish, severing his connection to it. If it had happened only once, it wouldn't have been a big deal. However, over the course of 3 years, the aura had appeared more than 10 times. Over and over again, his surge was interrupted, ensuring that he was constantly leaving his sect, and then going back and forth. It was torment. As he closed in on Mount Hood, he caught sight of Bai the Elgin, fuming with numerous frustrations. The man landed on the mountain top and waved his hand instantly, extinguishing the sputtering incense stick. The thunder ceased, and Bai the Elgin stared at the man in shock. Are you an immortal? Baizi Algan asked cautiously. Still unsure about what exactly was going on, he slipped his hand behind his back and grabbed an axe. Baizi Algan blinked a few times. Although he was still a bit scared, he sat up straight and quietly said, Junior most definitely is from the Bai clan. I and oppose am Baizi Algan. Alright, well tell me this, Li Qingwu said, his voice cool. Why did you lie that incense so many times over the past 3 years? He very much wanted to know the answer to his question. As soon as Baizi Algan heard the question, his mind spun as he tried to come up with a good answer. Finally, a melancholic expression appeared on his face, and he looked down toward the village at the bottom of the mountain. Junior is a sentimental and righteous person, he said. I simply couldn't bear to part with my fellow villagers every time I lit the incense. I was overwhelmed with feelings of sorrow. The mere thought of leaving them behind was far too painful. Li Qingwu stared in shock. He had never considered such a possibility, and as such, the anger in his heart faded. Even more, he could tell from this young man's words alone that he was definitely good material. However, the next thing he did was send his divine sense down toward the village, and he heard the sounds of drums and gongs and rejoicing. He even heard the villagers talking about how glad they were that the whistle was gone. An unsightly expression appeared on his face, and he felt a headache coming on. He looked back at the charming and pure Baizi Algan, who seemed like he wouldn't hurt a fly, and suddenly realized that this kid was a villain to the core. Tell me the truth, Li Qingwu said, his voice echoing like thunder. Baizi Algan was so frightened that he started shaking. Hey, you can't blame me, Baizi Algan said, sounding very miserable. What kind of crappy incense is this anyway? Every time I lit it, lightning would start crashing around everywhere. I almost got killed on several occasions. In fact, avoiding that lightning 13 times was quite a feat. Li Qingwu looked silently at Baizi Algan. If you were so scared, then why did you light it over 10 times? He asked. Cause I and oppose am scared of dying, Baizi Algan replied indignantly. Isn't the point of immortal cultivation to be able to live forever? I want to live forever. Li Qingwu was once again struck speechless. However, he found the kid's fascination with living forever laudable, and realized that his personality might change a bit after some hard training in the sect. After a moment of thought, he waved his sleeve, sweeping Baizi Algan up into a beam of light that shot off into the distance. All right, come with me, he said. Where are we going? Asked Baizi Algan, suddenly realizing that they were flying away and a pulse ray so high the ground was very, very far down, causing the blood to drain from his face. He immediately dropped his axe and grabbed onto the immortal's leg. Li Qingwu looked down at him, clutching his leg. Feeling a bit at a loss, he replied, The Spirit Stream Sect. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or Chapter 2. The Spirit Stream Sect was located in the Eastwood continent on the lower branch of the Havenspan River, and was divided between the north and south banks. Its history stretched back countless years, and was very famous in the area. 8 enormous cloud-wreathed mountains towered over the Havenspan River. 4 of those mountains were located on the north bank of the river, whereas 3 were on the south bank. Shockingly, one mountain, the most majestic of them all, rose up from the middle of the river itself. The entire top half of that mountain was covered with brilliant white snow, and rose up so high that the peak of the mountain wasn't even visible. The middle of the mountain had been hollowed out, allowing the golden river water to flow right through it, and causing the mountain itself to somewhat resemble a bridge. Currently, a beam of light was speeding along near the south bank of the Spirit Stream Sect. It was none other than Li Qingwu and Baizi Algan as they raced into the servants' quarters beneath the third peak. It was just possible to hear Baizi Algan shouting out in fear. He was scared to death. From all the flying, they had passed over countless mountains, and the entire time he had felt like he was losing his grip on Li Qinghu's leg. Eventually, Everything turned into a blur. When everything finally became clear again, he realized that they had landed just outside of a building. He stood there, legs trembling, looking around at a scene that was very different from what he was used to back at the village. Towering up in front of the building was a huge stone, upon which 3 characters were written in flamboyant calligraphy. Department of Servant Affairs. Sitting next to the stone was a pock-faced woman. As soon as she caught sight of Lei Qingwu, she rose to her feet and clasped hands in greeting. Send this kid to the ovens, Lei Qingwu said without another word, and paying no further heed to Bai Xiaogan. He then transformed into a beam of light that shot off into the distance. When the pock-faced woman heard him mention the ovens, she stared in shock. She looked Bai Xiaogan over, then handed him a bag which contained a servant's uniform and other items. Face expressionless, led him away from the building toward a nearby path, simultaneously explaining some of the basic sect rules and customs. The path was paved with green limestone and wound through numerous buildings and courtyards. The fragrant aroma of plants and flowers filled the air, and the entire place seemed like a celestial paradise. As he looked around, Bai Xiaogan's heart began to thump with excitement, and his previous nervousness and anxiety began to fade. This place is awesome, he thought. It and the pulse elsewhere better than the village. His eyes shone with anticipation. As he followed the woman along, the scenery only continued to get more and more spectacular. He even saw some beautiful women along the way, which instantly caused his heart to surge with delight. Soon Bai Xiaogan got even more excited. That was because he caught sight of what appeared to be their destination. At the end of the path was a 7-story building that sparkled like crystal. There were even celestial cranes soaring in the air above it. Are we there yet, elder sister? Bai Xiaogan asked excitedly. Yes, she replied coolly, her face as expressionless as ever. She pointed to a small path off to the side. That's where we're going. Bai Xiaogan looked in the direction she was pointing, heart bursting with anticipation. But then his entire body went stiff, and he rubbed his eyes. He looked again, a bit more closely, and saw a gravel path lined by haphazardly constructed thatch-roofed huts that looked like they might disintegrate at any moment. A strange aroma wafted out from the area. Bai Xiaogan wanted to cry, but no tears would come. Still clinging to a scrap of hope, he asked the pock-faced woman another question. Elder sister, did you point in the wrong direction just now? Nope, she replied coolly, stepping onto the gravel path. When Bai Xiaogan heard her response, all of the beauty of the place seemed to disappear. A bitter expression appeared on his face as he continued to follow her. The entire area was filled with hundreds of huge cooking woks, within which fat men were boiling rice. Sensing that someone had approached, the young man looked up and saw the pock-faced woman. The fattest of the young men, one who looked like a mountain of flesh, hefted his ladle and hurried over. The ground trembled as he walked, and his fat bounced and jiggled in a way that made Bai Xiaogan stare in shock without even thinking about it. He began to feel around for an axe. The magpies were singing especially beautiful songs this morning, and now I know why, the mountain of flesh cried out as he ran over. His eyes flickered with a lustful gleam. It was all because you were coming, big sis. Could it be that you've changed your mind? You finally realized how talented I am, and want to take advantage of this auspicious day to formally become my Taoist partner. The pock-faced woman looked at the mountain of flesh with both disgust and anger. I'm just here to deliver this kid to the ovens, she said. Task accomplished. You'll take my leave now. Then she hurried off. Bai Xiaogan gasped. He had taken the time to check out the woman on their way here, and she really looked like a freak. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of taste this fat man had. Apparently even someone with a face like hers got him all hot and bothered. Before Bai Xiaogan could consider the matter anymore, the mountain of flesh was suddenly standing in front of him, panting a bit. The young man was so huge that Bai The Elgin found himself completely covered by his shadow. The Elgin looked up at the enormous young man, and his quivering rolls of flesh, and swallowed hard. This was actually his first time ever seeing someone so fat. The mountain of flesh glanced resentfully at the pock-faced woman, who was making her way back up the gravel path, then looked back at the Elgin. Well, we have a newcomer. We'd left a spot open for Zubikai to join, so this complicates matters. The Elgin felt nervous, just looking at the young man's enormity, and subconsciously took a few steps back. Elder brother, I am your humble servant. The Elgin. The Elgin, in white skin, slender and dainty, you look pretty innocent. Excellent, excellent. Your name really fits my taste. The mountain of flesh looked him over, then clapped the Elgin on the shoulder, which very nearly sent the Elgin flying off to the side. Oh, what's your name, elder brother? The Elgin took a deep breath and looked up thoughtfully, as he prepared to make fun of the young man's name. The mountain of flesh chuckled and slapped his chest, causing the fat to ripple back and forth. I and Oppose am Big Fatty Jan, that's second Fatty Huan, and that's third Fatty Hay. As soon as the Elgin heard these incredibly stirring names, he abandoned any plans to make fun of them. As for you, Big Fatty, Jan continued, from now on you'll be ninth Fatty by a weight. Second, junior brother, you're way too skinny. If you go around looking like that, you'll lose face for the ovens. Well, I guess that doesn't matter for now. Don and Oppose to worry after a few years. You'll get fat too. Then we'll call you Ninth Fatty Bye. When the Elgin heard the nickname Ninth Fatty Bye, he grimaced. Well, since you and Oppose are already our ninth junior brother, you don't and Oppose to count as an outsider anymore. Here in the Elgins, we have a long-standing tradition of carrying walks on our backs. See this walk here on my back. He slapped the walk and continued boastfully. It's the king of walks, forged from the highest quality iron and engraved with an earth flame spell formation. When you use this wok to cook up spirit rice, the flavor is far better than the rice cooked in any other wok. By the way, you have to choose a wok to carry on your back, too. Then you'll look really impressive. Glancing at Big Fatty Shan's wok, and realizing that everyone else in the ovens was similarly adorned, the Elgin suddenly got an image of himself walking around in such a fashion. Elder brother, he blurted, is it possible to opt out of the wok carrying thing? Are you kidding me? Wok carrying is an important tradition in the ovens. Later on when you're out in the sect, people will see the wok on your back and instantly recognize that you're from the ovens. Once they know that, they won't dare to pick on you. The ovens has a lot of influence around here. You know, Big Fatty. Jan winked at the Elgin, allowing no further discussion of the matter. He led the Elgin to one of the thatch-roofed huts, within which were stacks of thousands of woks, most of which were covered in layers of dust. Clearly, no one had been in here for quite some time. Go ahead and pick one, ninth junior brother. Then come on over and help tend to the rice. If the rice burns, then the elder disciples will make a scene again. With that, Big Fatty Jan turned and ran back to join the other fat men, as they hustled and bustled among the more than 100 cooking woks. Sighing in despair, the Elgin looked over the woks and was agonizing over which one to pick when he suddenly noticed one particular wok off in the corner, buried under a big pile. It was a unique wok that, instead of being circular, was shaped like an oval. It almost didn't even look like an oval, but rather like a turtle shell. There were also some faint markings visible on its surface. The Elgin's eyes brightened, and he quickly walked over and squatted down to look at the wok more closely. After dragging it out and examining it further, his eyes began to shine with satisfaction. He had been fond of turtles ever since he was young, mostly because they represented longevity. Considering that he had come to learn about immortal cultivation for the purposes of living forever, as soon as he saw the turtle shell wok, he knew that it was an auspicious sign, good omen. After he emerged with the wok, big fatty Jan caught sight of him, and hurried over, ladle in hand. Ninth junior brother, why did you pick that one? He asked sincerely, rubbing his ample belly. That wok has been in there for years, and nobody has ever used it, mainly because it looks like a turtle shell, and people don't want to put it on their backs. Are you sure? Ninth junior brother. I and the Pulse am sure, Isaac Alkin said resolutely, looking fondly at the wok. This is the wok for me. Big fatty Jan tried to dissuade him some more, but eventually realized that Isaac Alkin had made up his mind. Finally, he gave him a strange look and stopped trying. After assigning him one of the oven's thatch-roofed huts for housing, he went back to work. Soon, dusk had fallen. Isaac Alkin sat in his thatch-roofed hut, examining the turtle-shaped wok. One thing that stuck out to him were the designs traced on the back of the wok, which were so faint that you wouldn't see them unless you looked closely. He could instantly tell that this was no ordinary wok. Carefully putting it on the stove, he looked around the little hut. It was very simple. In addition to the stove, it had a bed, a desk, and an ordinary copper mirror hanging on the wall. As Isaac Alkin had his head turned to look around, the seemingly ordinary wok behind him suddenly emitted a flash of violet light. As far as Isaac Alkin was concerned, this had been a day packed with all sorts of momentous events. He had finally arrived in the land of his dreams, a world of immortals. At the moment, he was still in a bit of a daze. After a bit of time passed, he took a deep breath, and his eyes began to shine with anticipation. I, the Pulse, am gonna live forever. As he sat there, he pulled out the bag which the pock-faced woman had given him. Inside the bag was a medicinal pill, a wooden sword, some incense, a servant's uniform, and a command medallion. Finally, there was a bamboo scroll with several small characters written on the cover. Violet Key Cauldron Control Art, Key Condensation Manual. It was evening, and Big Fatty Jan and the others in the ovens were bustling about. Meanwhile, Isaac Alkin was looking at the bamboo scroll, eyes shining with anticipation. He had come here in order to learn how to live forever, and he held the key to achieving that goal in his hands right now. After taking a deep breath, he opened the scroll. Moments later, his eyes were gleaming with excitement. The bamboo scroll had 3 pictures and accompanying text that described how cultivation was divided into 2 stages of key condensation and foundation establishment. As far as the Violet Key Cauldron Control Art, it was divided into 10 levels, each of which corresponded to the 10 levels of key condensation. By practicing cultivation to a given level, it was possible to exercise control over physical objects. After reaching the 3rd level, you could control half of a small cauldron. At the 6th level, it became half of a large cauldron. At the 9th level, it was a full cauldron. As for the final full circle, you could actually control 2 full cauldrons. Unfortunately, this scroll only described up to the 3rd level of the art, with no further information about the subsequent levels. The key to the whole thing was cultivation, using a prescribed set of breathing techniques to develop the Violet Key Cauldron Control Art. Isaac Alkin cleared his mind and began to regulate his breathing. Then he closed his eyes and imitated the posture depicted in the first picture in the bamboo scroll. He was able to hold on for 3 breaths of time before intense pain filled him. Finally, he let out a shout and gave up. From what he could tell, using this breathing technique actually sucked all the air out of him, making it impossible to actually breathe. This is way too hard, he thought. According to the description under the picture, when you practice this kind of cultivation, you should be able to sense a strand of ki flowing through you. Just now, though, the only thing I felt was intense pain. He was starting to get frustrated. However, for the sake of living forever, he gritted his teeth and tried again. He repeated the process over and over again until it was the middle of the night. During that entire time, he never once sensed any sort of ki in his body. He had no way of knowing it, but even someone with exceptional latent talent who tried to cultivate the first level of the violet key cauldron control art would need at least a month to succeed, unless they had some outside help, considering that it was simply impossible that he could have succeeded after only a few hours. Body aching painfully, Baisi Elgin finally stretched, and was about to go wash his face, when all of a sudden, he heard a commotion outside. He stuck his head out of the window and immediately caught sight of a sallow-faced young man standing in the door of the main courtyard of the ovens. He looked angry. "I'm Zubakai, whoever it was that took my spot here. Get the hell out here right now." Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 3. The motion of Baisi Elgin sticking his head out of the window instantly attracted the attention of the sallow-faced young man. Enraged, he yelled, "So, you're the guy who took my spot." It was too late for Baisi Elgin to duck his head back into the window. He immediately pasted an innocent expression onto his face, and said, "No, it wasn't me." "Lie, you're so skinny and short, you're obviously a newbie here." Zubakai clenched his hands into fists and stared furiously at Baisi Elgin. He was so angry that he looked like he might explode at any moment. Feeling quite wronged, Baisi Elgin peeped. "It really had nothing to do with me. I don't care. 3 days from now on the southern slope of the sect, you and I are gonna have a fight to the death. If you win, then you'll have no choice other than to suck it up. If you lose, then I get my spot back." Zubakai shoved his hand into his robe and pulled out a blood notice, which he threw onto Baisi Elgin's windowsill. The notice was covered with countless versions of the character die, all of them written in blood. Baisi Elgin looked down at all the die characters, and couldn't miss the killing intent rolling off of them. His heart went cold. Then he remembered that Zubakai had just mentioned a fight to the death, and he gasped. "Elder brother, this isn't that big a deal. Why did you have to go and use your own blood to write so many characters? Didn't it hurt?" "Not a big deal," Zubakai roared, gnashing his teeth. "Humph, I've been living frugally for ages. I saved up spirit stones for 7 years. 7 years. Do you hear me? Only then could I afford to bribe the honor guard into getting me a spot in the ovens. Then you decide to stick your foot into the door. This enmity will never be reconciled. 3 days from now is the day you die." "I think you'll pass," Baisi Elgin said, picking up the blood notice gingerly between his thumb and forefinger, and then tossing it out the window. "You," raged Zubakai. Suddenly, he felt the ground shaking and he realized that there was a mountain of flesh standing there next to him. It was hard to say how long Big Fatty Zhang had been standing there, but there he was off to the side, coldly measuring up Zubakai. "Ninth Fatty," he said, addressing Baisi Elgin, "you're on dish duty with second brother." Then he looked back at Zubakai. "As for you, stop causing such a ruckus. Get your ass out of here." He swept his ladle through the air threateningly, causing a gust of wind to spring up. Zubakai's face fell and he backed up several steps. He wanted to keep arguing, but seeing the impatient look on Big Fatty Zhang's face, he shot a venomous look at Baisi Elgin, then stalked off. As Baisi Elgin thought about it, he realized that considering the vicious look Zubakai had given him, he was certain to pop up again at some point. Therefore, the best thing to do in this situation would be to stay put in the ovens. Most likely, Zubakai wouldn't dare to come back there and cause trouble. Days passed by. The Elgin slowly got used to working in the ovens during the day and cultivating the violet cauldron control art at night. However, progress was slow. Eventually he got to the point where he could endure for 4 breaths of time, but no more, leaving him very frustrated. On one particular night in the middle of his cultivation session, he suddenly heard a big commotion among the fat elder brothers. "Close the gate, close the gate. Hurry up, second Fatty Huang, close that gate. Third Fatty, hey, check and see if anyone is spying on us, quickly." Baisi Elgin blinked in shock. Having learned from his previous mistake, he avoided the window and peeked through a crack in the door. What he saw was a bunch of fatties bustling around the courtyard, so fast they were almost flying. Moments later, the main gate to the ovens was closed tightly. Furthermore, for some reason, a light mist had sprung up, making the fatties look even more mysterious than ever. Bai Ziaogen watched the scene playing out. The fatties were now hustling over to one particular thatched hut. Despite all the mist, Bai Ziaogen could clearly see Big Fatty Zhang's formidable frame, and he seemed to be speaking to the others. The whole scene was very odd, so Bai Ziaogen began to edge away from the door in an attempt to pretend he hadn't seen anything at all. However, it was at that exact point that Big Fatty Zhang's voice echoed out, "Ninth Fatty, I know you're watching, get out here." Although he didn't speak very loud, his voice instantly weighed down on Bai Ziaogen. Bai Ziaogen blinked a few times, then slowly walked out the door, putting on the innocent expression of a person who wasn't capable of even hurting a fly. As soon as he neared the group of fatties, Big Fatty Zhang grabbed him and pulled him over to stand among them. Almost immediately, Bai Ziaogen caught a whiff of some unique aroma, something that instantly caused a warm feeling to spread throughout his body. He looked around at the others and saw that they all had euphoric expressions on their faces for some reason. He also felt enlivened. It was then that he noticed that Big Fatty Zhang was holding a magical mushroom in his hand. It was about the size of an infant's hand, and as translucent as crystal. All it took was a single glance, and anyone could tell that it was no ordinary item. Big Fatty Zhang looked over at Bai Ziaogen, then held out the mushroom, and gruffly said, "Come on, ninth junior brother, take a bite." Replied Bai Ziaogen, eyeing the magical mushroom. Then he looked around at all the fat elder brothers and hesitated. Big Fatty Zhang instantly got irritated from the look on his face. If Bai Ziaogen didn't eat the mushroom, the two of them would become enemies. It wasn't just him. Second Fatty Huan, third Fatty He, and all the others were all glaring at Bai Ziaogen. Bai Ziaogen swallowed hard. Even in his wildest dreams, he would never have imagined himself in a situation where people would flip out in anger if he didn't take a bite of a priceless magical mushroom, as if it were nothing more than a chicken leg, and yet that was exactly what was happening right in front of his very eyes. Bai Ziaogen's heart was thumping as he gritted his teeth and accepted the magical mushroom. Finally, he opened his mouth and took a big bite. The mushroom instantly dissolved in his mouth, causing a wonderful sensation to fill his body, something many times more intense than what he had experienced moments before, when merely smelling it. Almost instantly, his face flushed bright red. "Excellent, elder son demanded that we use this 100-year-old magical mushroom in a soup. If we all take a bite, then we'll have to sink or swim together." Big Fatty Zhang looked extremely content as he opened his mouth and took a nibble. Then he tossed the mushroom to the next fatty in line, and soon all of them were munching on mushroom flesh. Now that they were all chewing together, the group smiled at Bai Ziaogen as if he were now one of them. Bai Ziaogen chuckled as he realized that all these guys were essentially partners in crime. Furthermore, considering they had gotten so fat this way, it probably wasn't dangerous to join them. It was little wonder Zhu Bekai had given him a challenge notice with the word "die" written on it so many times. "Elder brother," Bai Ziaogen said, "that magical mushroom was scrumptious. I feel like my whole body and apples is on fire." He licked his lips and looked impatiently at Big Fatty Zhang. In response, Big Fatty Zhang's eyes began to shine brightly. With a hearty laugh, he flamboyantly pulled out a silver flower, which he handed to Bai Ziaogen. "Now do you see how amazing the ovens is, junior brother? I wasn't lying. Alright, eat up, eat till you and the pulse restopped." Bai Ziaogen's eyes began to shine as he took a big bite. Next, Big Fatty Zhang pulled out some sort of natural precious material, something that looked like a golden jewel which emanated a fragrant aroma. Bai Ziaogen needed no prompting from Big Fatty Zhang. He immediately took a bite and swallowed it down. The tangy flavor filled him with a wonderful sensation. After that, Big Fatty Giant produced an incredibly sweet red spirit fruit. More items emerged: magical mushrooms, various medicinal ingredients, spirit fruits, and other precious items. Baizialgan partook of them, all as did the other fatties. He ate so much that soon his head was spinning. He almost felt drunk, his body hot and burning to the point where white steam rose up from the top of his head. He already felt as fat as a bull. The more he ate, the more kindly Big Fatty Shan and the others looked at him. In the end, they slapped their stomachs and laughed heartily, and they all truly seemed like partners in crime. Head swimming by the Alcan stretched out his arms and legs. His hand landed on Big Fatty Shan's giant stomach, and his foot landed off to the side. He began to laugh along with the others. Other servant departments would kill to get one of their own into the outer sect, but we kill to make sure we stay out. Who wants to go there anyway? What's so good about the outer sect? Ha, Big Fatty! Jan sounded very proud of this as he finished speaking. He pulled out a ginseng root. The root itself had countless faintly visible H-rings and was covered with numerous rootlets. Clearly, this ginseng root was very old. Ninth junior brother, our cultivation bases are all strong enough that we could have become outer sect disciples a long time ago. However, we prefer to hide our true level. Look, there are outer sect disciples kill for the chance to get a single bite of a 100-year-old ginseng root like this. Do we look scared? Big Fatty Shang subsequently plucked a rootlet off and popped it into his mouth, chewed and swallowed. Then he handed the ginseng root to Bai Ziaokan. Bai Ziaokan was so stuffed, he almost couldn't see straight. Elder brother, I and the pulse am full. I really can't eat another bite. Before he could even finish speaking, Big Fatty Shang plucked off a rootlet and stuffed it into Bai Ziaokan and Paul's mouth. Ninth junior brother, you're far too skinny. So skinny that the girls in the sect won't like you. In our sect, they like guys like us, brothers, stalwart and plump. Come on, eat. Big Fatty Shang let out a huge burp. Then he picked up a stack of empty bowls, simultaneously pointing to two scrolls hanging on either side of the nearby thatched hut, upon which was written a couplet. Look, we have a saying here that goes, I'd rather starve to death in the ovens than struggle up the ladder in the outer sect. Bai Ziaokan looked over at the couplet and said, yeah, for sure, we all want to starve to death here. Yeah, starve to death. Then he slapped his stomach and let out a burp. Hearing this, Big Fatty Shan and the others all started laughing. They all were finding Bai Ziaokan to be increasingly charming. Today is a great day, Big Fatty, Jan said. Ninth junior brother, I have something important to tell you. We have certain ways of doing things here in the ovens, and to fit in, you need to memorize a certain mnemonic. Pay attention. Fruits and herbs of a magical nature, nibble the edges, but spare the stem. Slice the meat thin. When there and the pulse, add some to butcher. As for the bones, leave some flesh on them. Spirit candy, water it down until it and the pulse, add thin, fine wine, half a cup will do you in. These 6 lines were compiled after years of suffering by previous generations. If you go about eating following these principles, then you're guaranteed to be safe. Alright, let's call it a night. Head to sleep. Everyone, today's midnight snack is over. The outer sect disciples are still waiting for their soup. As he spoke, Big Fatty Zhang began to fill the empty bowls with rice gruel. Bai Ziaokan's head was spinning, and he could and opposed. He stopped thinking about the 6 lines of truth he had just been told. He looked over at Big Fatty Zhang and the others filling up the bowls. Let out a burp, then squatted down to examine the bowls themselves. Then his mouth turned up into a smile. Elder brothers, these bowls are too nice. Big Fatty Zhang and the others looked back at him with strange expressions. Looking as charming as ever, he chuckled and said, at first glance, they don't look very big, but can actually hold a lot of food. Why don't we make them look big, but hold less food? For example, we could make the bottom of the bowls thicker. Big Fatty Jan stared in shock as though he had just been struck by lightning. His rolls of fat then began to quiver, and his eyes began to shine brightly. The other fatties began to pant, and their fat also began to tremble. All of a sudden a loud smacking sound rang out as Big Fatty Jan slapped his thigh. Then he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Yes, 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 that's an idea worth passing down. Future generations in the ovens will all benefit from this. Ninth junior brother. I never imagined that someone as charming as you would actually be as crafty as this. Ha ha ha, you were born to be a part of the ovens. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 Chapter 4. Everyone was in a wonderful mood, and were extremely pleased with Busy Alcon. Not only was he very charming, he seemed to have lots of crafty ideas. Big Fatty Shang decided that a reward was in order, and pressed a grain of spirit rice into Busy Alcon's hand. Busy Alcon laughed happily as he staggered back to his room. Before he could climb in bed, all of the spiritual energy he had absorbed by eating the various precious materials suddenly burst out inside of him. His head spun, and he flopped face first down onto the ground, where he immediately began snoring. He slept wonderfully for the entire night. The following morning at dawn, when he opened his eyes, they shone brightly. He looked down to find that he was fatter than the day before. Furthermore, his skin was covered in a sticky layer of filth. When he hurried out to wash up, Big Fatty Shan and the others were preparing breakfast for the sept disciples. When they saw Busy Alcon's bedraggled appearance, they started laughing. Ninth junior brother, all that filth comes from the impurities in your body. Once you get rid of it, it will be much easier for you to practice cultivation. Take a few days off. We won't need your help anyway. In a few days, you can start working again. Don't forget about that grain of spirit rice. Eat it up quickly, before it goes bad. Sure thing, Busy Alcon replied, feeling quite energetic. He returned to his room and grabbed the turtle-shaped wok off of the stove. After filling it with water from the washroom, he returned and put it back on the stove. Then he pulled out the grain of spirit rice to examine it. It was about the size of his thumb, crystalline in appearance, and fragrantly aromatic. If immortals eat this stuff, then it must be incredible. Sighing, he threw a few pieces of wood into the stove, then lit the fire. He was immediately hit by a blast of heat, which caused him to back up, blinking anxiously. Then he looked down at the fire, and clicked his tongue. That's no ordinary fire. It lights faster, and also burns a lot hotter than the fire in the village. Taking another look at the burning logs in the fire, he realized that they were not ordinary pieces of wood. About this time, the fire began to burn, even hotter than before, and Busy Alcon watched in amazement as one of the designs etched into the back of the turtle shell wok began to light up, starting at what appeared to be the tail of the turtle shell, and ending where the head would be. Soon, the entire design was shining brightly. Busy Alcon stared in amazement, then slapped his thigh. I knew it. This is some sort of treasure. It and the pose as definitely way better than eldest brother's wok. More certain than ever that this wok was something extraordinary. Busy Alcon quickly tossed the grain of spirit rice into the water. Then he set off to the side with the violet cauldron control art bamboo scroll, emulating the movements and breathing techniques depicted in the first picture. He began to cultivate. He had only just begun when, suddenly, his eyes went wide. The posture, which had been so difficult to maintain just the day before, was now much easier to assume. In fact, he actually felt very comfortable, felt the slightest sensation of awkwardness. In addition, the breathing technique no longer left him feeling as if he were suffocating. Instead, he felt a very pleasant sensation. Furthermore, he was absolutely certain that before today, he could only maintain the posture for about 3 or 4 breaths of time. But this time, after 7 or 8 breaths, he did and opposed to feel the least bit of pain or discomfort. Suppressing his excitement, the organ calmly continued until 30 breaths of time had passed. Just when he was finally starting to feel weak and uncomfortable, a strand of ki suddenly appeared inside of him. It was very cold and swirled around rapidly. Before it could make a full circle through his body, it vanished. However, the organ was so excited, he leapt to his feet. Ki! Ha ha ha! Finally some ki appeared. Bursting with excitement, he began to pace back and forth in his room. He quickly came to the conclusion that it must have something to do with all the precious materials he had consumed the previous night. Suddenly he wished he had eaten more. No wonder elder brother Zhang would rather starve to death in the ovens than go climb the ladder in the outer sect. Not even the outer sect disciples would have opportunities like this. Sitting down anxiously, he once again began to practice cultivation. This time, he was able to maintain the posture and breathing for a full 60 breaths of time. At that point, a flow of ki appeared in him, almost a trickle, that rapidly circulated through his body. Having experienced this once before, he was ready, and began to guide the ki through a specific path, as indicated by the first picture in the bamboo scroll. Soon, the ki was flowing through him in just the way he wanted. He maintained the posture and movements indicated in the first illustration, and as he did, he could sense streams of coldness emerging from various parts of his body, almost like drops of water, which merged into the ki flow, causing it to grow larger and larger. In the end, it was like a tiny stream, flowing in a continuous cycle. Tremor ran through him, and it was as if a layer of fog had suddenly been stripped away from his mind. A rumbling sound echoed out from his body. He suddenly felt lighter and more agile than before. At the same time, globules of filth were expelled from the pores all over his body. Unlike last time, the stream of ki inside of him didn't vanish, but instead remained there, circulating through his body. The organ opened his eyes, and they shone even more brightly than before. His mind even seemed to move a bit quicker, and his body felt lighter and faster. A permanent ki vessel, he thought excitedly. That's the sign that I and oppose we successfully cultivated the first level of the violet ki cauldron control art. It also means that I've reached that, what's it called, the first level of ki condensation. The organ was overjoyed and immediately ran to the washroom. When Big Fatty, Jan, and the others saw him, they exchanged knowing glances, although they were a bit surprised that the organ had reached the first level so quickly. They all knew why it had happened. After returning to his room, the organ took a deep breath, and then began to study the bamboo scroll more thoroughly. After cultivating the first level of the violet cauldron control art, I should be able to control physical objects. Well, this is basically an immortal magical technique. I should be able to shoot things through the air. Eyes shining, he followed the instructions prescribed in the scroll, moving both hands together in a special way to perform an incantation. Then, he waved his finger at the nearby desk. Instantly, the stream inside of him surged like a bucking bronco, racing toward his right index finger, and then out through the tip of his finger. It turned into something like an invisible thread, which then attached itself to the nearby desk. However, almost as soon as it reached the desk, the connection grew unstable, and the thread disintegrated. The organ's face went pale. After a moment of recuperation, he reviewed what he had just done, then decided to give up on moving the desk. Instead, he pulled out the wooden sword from his bag and placed it on top of the desk. He wasn't sure what type of wood the sword was made from, but despite being much lighter than the desk, it still seemed unusually heavy. He waved his finger toward it, and the wooden sword twitched, then slowly floated an inch up into the air, before falling back down onto the desk. The organ was anything but discouraged. After a few more excited attempts, he was able to get the sword to rise higher and higher. Soon it was 10 inches, then 20, then 30. By the time dusk fell, he could get the wooden sword to fly in a straight line, although it wasn't very fast. And he could and post quite make it turn. It wouldn't fall down as easily as it had when he first started practicing. Henceforth, I, Bai Xiaokan, am an immortal. He rose proudly to his feet, held his left hand behind his back, and then waved his right hand, causing the wooden sword to fly steadily back and forth in his room. Eventually, his ki began to grow unstable, so he put the wooden sword away and continued to practice cultivation. Later, he caught wind of a fragrant aroma coming from the walk, causing him to raise his head and take a deep sniff. Suddenly feeling ravenous, he realized that he had been busy cultivating all day and had completely forgotten about the spirit rice boiling in the wok. He immediately walked over and lifted the lid to look inside. The moment he did, the strong, fragrant aroma of spirit rice wafted out. Furthermore, at some point during the process, a brilliant, glowing silver design had appeared on the surface of the rice. The design was clearly visible, and when Bai Xiaokan looked at it closely, he suddenly felt lost within the light. After a while, though the design began to fade, he narrowed his eyes and after some more thought picked up the grain of spirit rice and held it in his hand for a closer look. That design looks really familiar. His eyes flickered with a thoughtful gleam. He ducked his head to look under the stove, and saw that the fire had long since burned out. The pieces of wood were nothing more than ash now, and the design on the wall had once again faded into obscurity. However, he could still tell that the silver design on the grain of rice was the same design as the one on the back of the wall. He decided not to continue to investigate the design, and to be safe chose not to eat the rice for the time being. Instead, he put it into his bag, sat there for a moment in contemplation, then left his hut to help Big Fatty Shan and the others. Before long, half a month had passed. Bai Xiaokan's cultivation progress had once again slowed down. However, after some discreet inquiries, he learned that silver designs never appeared on spirit rice when it was cooked. His curiosity had definitely been piqued. The more he learned about it, the more it seemed that there was something special about this particular grain of rice, not to mention his wok, which seemed even stranger. A few days later, Third Fatty had left the ovens to go purchase supplies, giving Bai Xiaokan the perfect opportunity to sneak into the Four Seas room, a place where servants could get general information about cultivation. On his way back to his hut, he did his best to conceal the excitement which filled his heart. After closing the door behind him, he immediately took out the grain of spirit rice and studied the silver design. Gradually, an expression of disbelief appeared on his face. When immortals practice cultivation, there are 3 skills they can and oppose to do without. The first is medicine concocting, the second is equipment forging, and the third is spirit enhancement. Bai Xiaogan thought back to the images he had dug up when searching through the ancient records in the Four Seas room. One of them had closely resembled the silver design that was now visible on the grain of rice. Spirit enhancement. After a moment, he took a long, deep breath. Spirit enhancement was a special technique in which the energy of heaven and earth was forced into physical objects. It was a type of magic that essentially replaced the natural functions of nature, a technique which could be used on medicinal pills, incense, or magical items. Unfortunately, it was forbidden by heaven and earth, ensuring that the rate of success was limited. A success would lead to the item being vastly more powerful. A failure would result in the spiritual energy of the item becoming completely useless. The most shocking thing about spirit enhancement was that it could be performed over and over again. Every success increased the effects of the spirit enhancement by tenfold, leading to heaven-shaking, earth-toppling transformations. Of course, the more precious the item was to begin with, the more terrifying the results of success would be. Unsurprisingly, the chances of success decreased with each enhancement. In fact, after a certain point, even some spirit enhancement grandmasters wouldn't dare to go any further. After all, the ramifications of a failure in that case would be difficult to accept. The ancient records said that the spirit stream sect's guardian treasure is an item that was somehow enhanced 10 times by spirit enhancement. The heaven-horn sword by the Alkan's throat felt dry, eyes shining with disbelief and confusion. He swallowed and looked over at the turtle-shaped walk. There were 10 faint decorative lines on the back of it, and when he looked at them, his heart began to beat so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. As of this moment, he was sure that the design which had appeared on the spirit rise was a mark of spirit enhancement. Furthermore, the source of that design was none other than his walk. After a moment of hesitation, he gritted his teeth. If he didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, he'd WOULDN, and opposed to be able to sleep. He knew for a fact that this walk was something extraordinary, and therefore he COULDN, and opposed to let anyone in on his secrets. He waited until it was late in the night, then very quietly tiptoed over to the walk after taking a deep breath, and trying not to think about what would happen if he failed. He pulled out his wooden sword and threw it inside, the same way he had thrown the grain of rice in previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 5. After waiting for what seemed like forever, nothing unusual happened. Alkan looked thoughtfully at the patterns on the turtle walk, and then looked down into the stove itself. Nothing remained of the wood, but ash, so he left, returned a few minutes later with some more firewood. Firewood for personal use wasn't very common in the ovens, so he'd been forced to go find Big Fatty Zhang to make a special request for some more. After kindling the fire the Alkan once again focused on the first design on the turtle walk. As the wood burned, the design lit up. The Alkan's heart began to thump with excitement, and then suddenly, the wooden sword began to shine with blinding silver light. He backed up a few paces, after which the light slowly faded away, and a piercing sensation began to emanate out from inside the walk. He took a deep breath and carefully sidled up to the walk. The wooden sword, just like the grain of spirit rice, now had a bright silver design on it which gradually faded to a deep silver color. The sword appeared different than before. Although it was still made of wood, it now seemed more like it was made from metal. Alkan's eyes lit up as he carefully took the sword out of the walk. It felt heavier, and also emanated a certain coldness. It worked. My first spirit enhancement on the wooden sword worked. Alkan fondled the sword ecstatically, then glanced over at the walk and tried to decide what to do with it. In the end, he decided to just leave it where it was. The more he treated it like an ordinary item, the less likely it was that anyone would pay attention to it. As for the spirit rice, he decided to eat it bit by bit over time. He would also be careful to not let anyone see the wooden sword. As an added measure, he came up with the idea of somehow painting over the glowing design. Finally, he tidied his room, then walked out nonchalantly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Over the next few days, he collected some various liquid materials from the ovens, which he used to paint the sword, making it bright and colorful, albeit somewhat unsightly. The most important thing was that the spirit design was covered up well enough that it wasn't obvious. In the end, Alkan nodded his head in satisfaction. As the days passed, Alkan became as comfortable with life in the ovens as a fish in water. He quickly fit in with the other elder brothers, and also became familiar with the work that went on there. He soon found that different types of fire were necessary for cooking different spirit foods. In fact, the different types of fire were described in terms of color. There were one-colored flames, two-colored flames, and so on. The wood he had used earlier to heat the turtle walk had been one-colored firewood. Big Fatty Zhang began to grow especially fond of Alkan, and took special care of him. Furthermore, just as he said, After a few months passed, Bai Xiaokan was starting to gain weight. He was no longer the scrawny kid he had been when he had first joined the sect. He was fatter, but at the same time, his skin was also fairer and clearer than before. He also looked more harmless than ever and was clearly reaching the point of being deserving of the title Ninth Fatty Bai. He also experienced a special snack time arrangement on more than one occasion. However, what Bai Xiaogan found especially frustrating was that, despite gaining weight, his cultivation seemed to progress as slowly as ever. Eventually, he stopped worrying about that and spent most of his time eating and drinking with his elder brothers. Life was good. As the months passed, he heard bits of gossip about recent events in the Spirit Stream sect. In addition, Big Fatty Zhang taught him more about the sect in general. He learned that the sect disciples were divided into the inner and outer sects. Any servant who could practice cultivation all the way to the third level of key condensation would be able to challenge one of the trials by fire, which were paths that existed on the various mountain peaks in the sect. A servant who passed the trial by fire could join that mountain peak as an outer sect disciple. Only by becoming an outer sect disciple could anyone truly become a part of the Spirit Stream sect. However, accomplishing such a feat would count as a stunning accomplishment, and would be equivalent to the old saying about the fish leaping over the dragon gate. Only the top 3 competitors in the monthly trials by fire would be accepted, meaning that the number of people who could become an outer sect disciple was limited. On one particular day, 7th Fatty had been scheduled to go out and purchase supplies, but ended up being busy with some other matters. As a result, Big Fatty Zhang called for Bai Xiaokan and told him to stand in for 7th Fatty. Bai Xiaokan hesitated for a moment, recalling the incident with Zhu Bikai from a few months before. Although it probably wasn't anything to worry about, he couldn't shake his anxiety. Before leaving, he went back to his room and collected 8 meat cleavers. 1 quick note about the meat cleavers. In Chinese the word is literally vegetable knife, and could more properly be translated as kitchen knife. However, the most common kitchen knife that you find in most Chinese households is what we would call a cleaver in English. You can see that by going to Baidu and doing an image search for the term vegetable knife in Chinese. You'll see a couple normal kitchen knives in that image search, because the word could also mean that. However, in both home kitchens and restaurant kitchens in China, cleavers are used for everything from cutting big chunks of meat to julienning vegetables, as you can see demonstrated by Anthony Borden and Eric Rappert in this video, and also donned 6 long leather coats. By the time he was finished getting dressed, he looked like a round ball. However, he also felt much safer, which was the important thing. The last thing he did was strap his walk onto his back, leaving him feeling very safe. He then staggered out of the ovens and down the mountain. As he walked along the green limestone paths in the sect, he gazed around at the beautiful buildings and the courtyards, and began to feel prouder than ever. How time flies, he mused, clasping his hands behind his back. Life is like a dream. Bai Xiaokan have only spent a few months practicing cultivation. However, as I think back to the mortal world and my life in the village, it fills my eyes with tears. He walked along with 8 meat cleavers hanging from his belt, walk on his back, and multiple layers of clothing, looking very much like a dilapidated toy ball. Occasionally, he would encounter other servants who would stare at him out of the corners of their eyes as he passed. There were even a few female disciples who couldn't help but laugh out loud when they saw him. They covered their mouths with their hands, and the sound of their laughter was like silver bells, clear and melodious. Face slightly flushed, Bai Xiaogan couldn't help but feel even more impressive than ever. Clearing his throat, he stuck his chest out and continued to saunter along. Before too much time had passed, and before he had even left the 3rd peak servants district, he noticed that quite a few servants were rushing off into the distance, looking very excited. They appeared to be heading in the direction of the path that led up to the top of the 3rd peak, a place where outer sect disciples often congregated. More and more servants began running over in that direction, looking very excited, surprised by the scene. Isaac quickly grabbed a scrawny servant who happened to be running by. Junior brother, what's going on? Isaac asked quizzically. Why is everyone running over there? The young man looked over angrily, but then saw the black wog on Isaac back, and his expression turned envious. IDN, and supposed to realize you were from the Elvin's elder brother. Why don't you come along to chosen from the outer sect? Zhu Hong and Zhang Yide are fighting it out in the trial by fire arena. Supposedly, the two of them have a beef with each other. Whatever happens, they and oppose rebels at the 6th level of key condensation. So we should be able to learn a bit by watching them, and maybe even gain some enlightenment. Finishing his explanation, the young man hurried off, apparently worried about missing out on any of the action. Feeling very curious, Isaac set off in a hurry, following the flow of people as they left the servants' district, and headed to the foot of the 3rd peak, where a large raised platform could be seen. The platform was about 3,000 meters wide and was surrounded by a crowd of servants. There were even people watching from positions further up on the mountain, all of whom wore resplendent clothing, and were clearly outer sect disciples. 2 young men occupied the platform, both of whom wore extravagant outfits. One of them had a scar running down his face, the other had skin as white as jade. The 2 of them were fighting back and forth, causing booming sounds to echo out. The glow of magical items surrounded both of them. Floating in front of the scar-faced youth was a small flag that fluttered of its own volition, as if some invisible hand were waving it. The swirling flag formed the shape of a mist tiger, which let out deafening roars. The jade-faced youth danced back and forth as he fought. He had a small blue sword, which whistled through the air, leaving behind streaks of light. When Isaac saw the sword flying about, he gasped. Although he could control his own wooden sword in a similar way, it would be impossible to even compare his level of skill with that of the jade-faced young man. What was even more remarkable was how the 2 young men didn't and opposed seemed to be holding anything back. Killing intent rolled off of them, and within a short time, numerous deadly situations arose. Both were heavily wounded, and despite the fact that the wounds weren't critical, it was still a shocking sight. This was Isaac first time seeing cultivators fighting, and it was very different from how he had imagined immortals would look when they fought the cruel and vicious way they attacked each other. Left his heart pounding in fear. Immortal cultivation isn't just about living forever. What's this fighting and killing all about? What if I end up losing my poor little life? Isaac swallowed nervously as he watched the scar-faced youth mist tiger lunging voraciously at What was even more remarkable was how the 2 young men didn't and opposed seemed to be holding anything back. Killing intent rolled off of them, and within a short time, numerous deadly situations arose. Both were heavily wounded, and despite the fact that the wounds weren't critical, it was still a shocking sight. This was Isaac first time seeing cultivators fighting, and it was very different from how he had imagined immortals would look when they fought the cruel and vicious way they attacked each other. Left his heart pounding in fear. Immortal cultivation isn't just about living forever. What's this fighting and killing all about? What if I end up losing my poor little life? Isaac swallowed nervously as he watched the scar-faced youth mist tiger lunging voraciously at the other young man. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Isaac suddenly realized that the outside world was a very dangerous place. It was probably a much better idea to stay back in the ovens where it was safe. Having reached this conclusion, he began to hurry off, when all of a sudden, he heard someone shouting his name. Isaac. He turned his head and saw the author of the blood notice, Zhu Bekai, hurrying in his direction. a vicious expression on his face. A wooden sword floated next to him, glittering with an unusual light that clearly surpassed the first level of key condensation. As the sword flew along, it left a streak of light in its wake, and sent a formidable spirit pressure emanating out. When Bai Xiaogan saw that wooden sword heading in his direction, his eyes went wide, and an intense sense of deadly crisis welled up in him. He's gonna kill me, he thought. Instantly, he began to run in the opposite direction, screaming, "Murder! Murder!" The other servants in the area all heard and looked over in shock. The cries were so loud that even Zhu Hong and Zhang Yat stopped fighting. In fact, even Zhu Bekai was unnerved by the screams. He had obviously just yelled Bai Xiaogan's name, and then started to chase him. His sword hadn't even touched Bai Xiaogan, and yet Bai Xiaogan was screaming as though he had been stabbed repeatedly. Zhu Bekai hated Bai Xiaogan so much his gums itched, face ashen. He ran after him, shouting, "Come on, Bai Xiaogan, you know how to fight, what are you running away for?" "If I knew how to fight, why would I be running away? You moron, I would have killed you a long time ago. Murder! Murder!" Bai Xiaogan's screams grew even louder as he fled in the opposite direction like a fat little bunny. Meanwhile, in a building which jutted out into the air at the very peak of the mountain, two men were in the middle of playing a game of Go. One was middle-aged, the other was an old man. The middle-aged man was none other than Li Qinglu. As for the old man, he had a full head of white hair and a ruddy complexion. His eyes glittered brightly, and he was clearly no ordinary individual. Currently, he was looking down at the scene playing out down below. Chuckling, he said, "What an interesting child you brought back to the sect, Qinglu. How embarrassing, sect leader. The kid's personality definitely needs a lot more work." Feeling a headache coming on, Li Qinglu placed his game piece onto the board, and then shook his head. "The kids in the ovens are pretty stuck up, and yet this kid fits right in." "And quite," scoffed the old man, stroking his beard, "and quite not an easy task." Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 6. The sound of Bai Xiaogan's screams undulated through the air beneath the third peak, catching the astonished attention of numerous servants. All of them could clearly see Bai Xiaogan, black wog on his back, wearing several layers of clothing, running at breakneck speed through the servants' district. He looked like a fat, round ball. From a distance it was difficult to actually make out Bai Xiaogan himself, but you would definitely see the black wog, which made him look almost like a beetle as he flew along. Then there were the 8 meat cleavers that hung from his belt, which clashed and clanked as he fled. "Murder!" he hollered as he ran, picking up speed. "Someone save me, I don't want to die." Zhu Bekai was hot on his tail, face ashen, eyes gleaming ferociously, and heart filled with both anxiety and rage. Chasing Bai Xiaogan this way was catching quite a bit of attention from the servants, and Zhu Bekai was worried that the honor guard might notice. The nervousness in his heart continued to grow. "Quit screeching, damn it!" Zhu Bekai raged. "Quiet down. What are you screaming for? Shoot up!" Gritting his teeth, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing the wooden sword to flicker with light, and then shoot toward the fleeing Bai Xiaogan. A clang rang out as the wooden sword slammed into Bai Xiaogan's black wog. As the noise echoed out, Bai Xiaogan continued running as if nothing had happened. Zhu Bekai gnashed his teeth. The big wog on Bai Xiaogan's back covered nearly half of his body, making it very difficult to hit him. However, feeling that he had little other choice, Zhu Bekai continued to give chase. And so they raced through the servants' district, Bai Xiaogan leading the way, Zhu Bekai running behind him. "This guy is pretty fast, even with that wog on his back," thought Zhu Bekai, huffing and puffing as he fell further behind in the chase. His cultivation base was at the second level of key condensation, and he was running as hard as he could. However, Bai Xiaogan was running with the passion of a rabbit whose tail had been stepped on. No matter what Zubekai did, he could and opposed to catch up. More horrifying was that he was starting to get tired, and yet hadn't even laid a finger on his opponent. In contrast, Baizialgan didn, and opposed he seemed to be the least bit tired at all, and was also screaming like a pig at the slaughterhouse. Soon, Baizialgan caught sight of the little path leading to the ovens, and his eyes glittered with excitement. He suddenly felt as though he were arriving home, and the sensation was so moving that he almost cried. "Elder brother, save me!" he cried. "He's trying to murder me!" A trail of dust rose into the air behind him as he ran toward the ovens at breakneck speed. Big Fatty Jan and the others heard his screaming and hurried out, shocked expressions on their faces. "Elder brother, save me! Zubekai is trying to kill me. My poor little life is on the line." Baizialgan quickly scrambled behind Big Fatty Jan. Big Fatty Jan's eyes gleamed with a ferocious light as he looked around vigilantly, but he saw no one. "Zubekai?" he asked. It was at this point that Zubekai finally appeared, huffing and puffing as he ran down the path toward the ovens. When Baizialgan realized how far behind Zubekai was, a quizzical expression appeared on his face. Why is he running so slowly?" Big Fatty Jan looked at Baizialgan, and then back at the panting Zubekai. The motion caused a fat on his face to quiver a bit. Zubekai had expended a lot of effort in the chase, so as he neared the ovens and then heard what Baizialgan said, he was filled with so much rage that he felt like he was about to explode. With a roar, he waved his right hand, sending his wooden sword stabbing toward a nearby tree. A bang could be heard, and the tree quivered as the sword pierced through it, leaving behind a gaping hole. "Baizialgan," he cried, "our differences are irreconcilable." His eyes were completely bloodshot as he glared at Baizialgan and then the hulking Big Fatty Jan. Finally, he turned angrily and began to stalk off back down the path. Baizialgan's heart was pounding as he looked at the hole in the tree. Then he looked back at the fuming Zubekai and swallowed hard as an uneasy feeling rose up in his heart. Big Fatty Jan looked at Zubekai's retreating figure, and his eyes flickered with a sinister gleam. Then he patted Baizialgan on the shoulder. "Don't worry, ninth junior brother. Zubekai might have some good connections in the sect, but if he dares show his face here again, we elder brothers will cut off one of his legs." Almost as soon as the words left his mouth, though, his tone changed, "although it would probably be best if you didn and oppose to leave the ovens. Ninth junior brother, you're looking a bit skinny. I think I should fatten you up a bit. After all, Elder Zu is celebrating his decade birthday in a few days." Baizialgan nodded his head absent-mindedly as he stared at the hole Zubekai's wooden sword had left in the tree. He then followed his elder brothers back into the ovens. Later, he sat in his room, brooding and feeling more uneasy than ever. The fact that his opponent could send a wooden sword through a tree meant that if it had hit him, he would definitely be a corpse now. "This isn't gonna work, not unless I plan on staying inside the ovens for the rest of my life. What if he catches me next time I go out?" Baizialgan just couldn't stop thinking about the venomous look Zubekai had cast his way before leaving. "I came here to live forever, not to die." The feeling of insecurity and anxiety caused Baizialgan's eyes to slowly become shot with blood. After a long moment passed, he gritted his teeth. "Fudge! I and oppose am gonna do it. I and oppose am gonna go all out. I and oppose am gonna go so all out that you'll terrify myself, let alone everyone else." His eyes were now completely bloodshot. Instead of saying that Baizialgan was the type of person who was afraid of dying, it would be more accurate to say that he was simply insecure. The ordeal he had just gone through had only served to stoke his determination. "I'm gonna practice cultivation. I and oppose am gonna get stronger." Baizialgan's breath came in ragged pants as he made his decision. he pulled out the violet key cauldron control art bamboo scroll, opened it up to the second illustration, and then immediately began to practice cultivation. He was afraid of dying, but he was also viciously persistent. Were he not, he would never have been able to light that stick of incense 13 times throughout the years, despite the threat of the lightning. Grinning with vicious determination, he assumed the posture in the second illustration, tenaciously maintaining the pose. Before, he had only been able to last for about 10 breaths of time, but this time, he actually lasted for 15. He ended up racked with pain, forehead dripping with great drops of sweat. However, the vicious gleam in his eye didn't fade. Soon, he was able to last for 20 breaths of time. Then 30. The small stream, that was the key vessel in his body, was now 10% complete. Gasping for breath, vision fading to black, he finally rested for a moment, then started cultivating again. The night passed relatively uneventfully. Soon it was the next day, and the day after that, and yet another day. Eventually 15 days went by. Other than eating and visiting the restroom, Baisialkan never left his room. To someone who had just begun the practice of cultivation, such tediousness was usually difficult to endure. However, Baisialkan didn't, and opposed to even come close to giving up. Big Fatty Shan, the others were shocked by his relentless practice of cultivation. It must be stated that cultivating the violet key cauldron control art was no easy task. In principle it was relatively simple. However, the postures that had to be maintained to reach the various levels all led to unimaginable pain, and therefore required incredible perseverance. Normally speaking, the servants in the sect would give up after only a few days of trying to cultivate it. Therefore, when Big Fatty Shan and the others saw Baisialkan continue to cultivate it for more than half a month, they felt like they were observing an entirely different person than the one they had met a few months ago. His clothes grew wrinkled, his hair became disheveled, his eyes were completely bloodshot, he seemed completely bedraggled, and at the same time, completely focused. Regardless of the pain he felt, he never gave up. Another thing that happened was that he began to lose some of the fat he had built up. At the same time, the spirit pressure he radiated increased by more than 50%. He was now very close to the great circle of the first level of key condensation. Apparently, all of the precious materials he had eaten had built up in his fat by practicing cultivation in the way it was forcing those items to materialize as part of his cultivation base. It also ended up making his body tougher than the average person. Ninth junior brother, why don't you take a break? You've been practicing cultivation non-stop for more than half a month. Big Fatty Shan and the others tried to persuade him to stop. However, when he looked up at them, they saw a gleam of determination in his eyes that left them shaken. Time passed. Soon Baisialkan had been practicing cultivation like mad for a full month. Big Fatty Shan and the others were shocked. In fact, Big Fatty Shan even said, "He's not cultivating, he's killing himself." By this point in his cultivation, Baisialkan could hold the pose in the second illustration for longer than 100 breaths of time. Soon, he reached 150 breaths of time. The spiritual energy inside of him was not a small stream anymore, it was far, far larger than that. Another month passed. Big Fatty Shan and the others trembled in fear, worried that Baisialkan really was killing himself from working too hard. Even as they were working up a plan to go get rid of Subakai, a huge rumbling could be heard coming from Baisialkan's hut. As the sound echoed about, the spirit pressure of the second level of key condensation erupted out from the hut, spreading for dozens of meters in all directions. As soon as Big Fatty Shan and the others sensed it, they looked up with expressions of shock. Little junior brother has broken through the second level of key condensation. He hasn't even partaken of the oven snack arrangement for more than half a year, and he's already reached the second level of key condensation. That's pretty rare. It took me a whole year to reach the second level of cake condensation even as they were making exclamations of shock. A crash could be heard as Baizialkan's door opened, and he burst out, looking exhausted and disheveled. However, his eyes were glittering brightly. Big Fatty Zhang and the others were just about to hurry over to offer congratulations when Baizialkan flashed through the air, nimbly landed on the bamboo fence that surrounded the ovens. He clasped his hands behind his back and tilted his head up proudly, looking off into the distance with a profound gleam in his eyes. He looked every bit like a proud, lonesome hero. Big Fatty Zhang and the others exchanged dismayed glances. What is he standing there for? He looks so weird. Did little junior brother get possessed or something? Almost as soon as they looked over at Baizialkan and his odd appearance, they heard his voice echoing out, sounding proud and wise. Zhu Bikai is a consummate chosen among the servants of the Spirit Stream sect, matchlessly vicious, and famous far and wide. His cultivation base is even in the terrifying second level of cake condensation. However, my cultivation base is also in the second level of cake condensation. A fight between us will be an even match. It will likely be a fight talked about in all the lands, a battle that will shake the entire sect. However, it must be fought no matter how much blood and gore flows, no matter how many bones are shattered and tendons wait a second. No, this battle is far, far too important. I have to keep practicing cultivation. Having finished speaking, Baizialkan looked around for a moment, then flicked his sleeve and returned to his room. The door slammed shut behind him as he began another session of secluded meditation. Big Fatty, Zhang, and the others swallowed hard and exchanged glances. Finally, Third Fatty had said, "Don't tell me we gave junior brother some spoiled food." Second Fatty Huang shivered and replied, "Oh no, this is bad. Junior brother is drunk on spiritual energy. He's gone crazy from cultivation. We mustn't provoke him now." Previous chapter.